Hello, class. My name is Randy, and today I'll be discussing the great evangelist Billy Graham. As historians, we must remember to use primary sources as our main sources of information. From those sources, we can interpret the truth. When we use secondary sources or sources not from a direct person involved, we should take great care to make sure we use them um, in the best possible way to ensure authenticity. As Christians, we must constantly strive to find the truth of God's work in the events of history, even when it seems his hand is removed from the world. All things are overseen by God, even if we don't understand it at the time, or possibly even in the future. Arguably the world's greatest evangelist, Billy Graham began his life under humble origins. Born the son of a farmer in North Carolina 4 days before the end of World War I, November 7th, 1918. Graham joked that it took only 4 days for people of the world to learn of his birth. He grew up in the Reformed Presbyterian Church, known for its strict Sabbath observation, psalm singing in lieu of hymns. Graham was nothing special when it came to his childhood, which, according to a biographer, Grant Wacker, is the very thing that made his childhood special. He was an average student, neither good or bad at most subjects. A 1934 revival associated with Mordecai Ham is where young Billy Graham fully dedicated his life to God. Stephen P. Miller claims that Billy Graham was the fourth most influential Southerner in history. The only people more influential would be Martin Luther King Jr., William Faulkner, and Elvis Presley. Not a bad place to be for a farm boy from North Carolina. Graham attended the fundamentalist-leaning liberal college art in Chicago called Wheaton University. There he met and befriended several African American students who attended the college. His study of anthropology at school soon led him to believe that there was no scientific basis for the idea of black inferiority on the genetic level. Graham gained national prominence in Los Angeles at his Canvas Cathedral Revival, which was conducted in the largest tent ever constructed for such an event. He told Los Angeles it was a city of sin and wickedness, a city that needed a revival. At this time, he was only 30 years old, but he was already a skilled minister, having preached to hundreds of thousands of teens at Youths for Christ rallies and other events of that nature. Despite being initially unsuccessful, another revival in Augusta exploded thanks to the efforts of William Randolph Hearst, who was famous for having said to Puff Graham, which of course added more to his fame and brought him even more into national prominence. Graham had his own understanding of the world, which he derived from revival tradition and American fundamentalism. One of the most famous revivalists from which Graham found his inspiration was D.L. Moody, and he often used Moody's analogies in his own sermon. Both Graham and Moody, the end of history is the pivotal event of history is Christ's second coming, as can be seen from several hundred references in the New Testament, according to Graham. He was also a premillennial, and they believed that the 1,000 years before the return of Christ will not be that of a period of peace. Instead, peace will only occur after the second coming. For Graham, the millennium is still in the future, possible only with Christ's return. Graham drew inspiration from, but also varied in belief from his Southern roots. During the early days of his ministry, the South was still a region influenced heavily by segregation and racism. Part of his likability, says Stephen Miller, arose from his polished, folksy, and personable Southern personality. At the beginning of his crusade, he initially followed the status quo in regards to how he spoke, or of who he spoke to in his events, and his events were segregated by race. But by the 1950s, he felt that it was no longer appropriate, and he began banning further segregation at any of his events. He spoke out in 1955 against racism, specifically calling it sin, not letting anybody call it just a simple mistake or ignorance. To him, there wasn't any excuse. Racism was wrong and was not to be tolerated. Graham said his grandson Boz never let differences, be they race, gender, or any other characteristic, get in the way of his love for the people. Graham always believed that all people, no matter who they were created in the image of God and also needed God's love equally. Graham believed, especially during the early period of the civil rights movement, that churches needed to speak out more about segregation that was occurring in their congregations and to preach more about racial tolerance. His tolerance was abundantly seen when he invited civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. to speak at his crusade in New York in 1957. The two would eventually become friends, and King stated that without the ministry of Graham, his own fight for civil rights would have been less effective. When Martin Luther King died, Graham stated that they had lost a social leader and a prophet. In more modern times, many minorities saw Billy Graham as an extension of the right-wingers who sought to curtail civil rights. But this is actually far from the truth. As already mentioned, Graham was a leader in the civil rights movement and one of the first Protestant ministers to speak out against the sin of Jim Crow laws when they were around. At one point, Graham said, "Only when Christ comes again will the little white children walk hand in hand with the little black children." Thankfully, he got that wrong. That's one of the things he got wrong. And today we have more tolerance and people can walk hand in hand. While Graham wasn't a politician, he did have some influence in the political arena. He was invited in the 50s to run for political office in North Carolina, and of course he refused, believing his life's work as an evangelist would supersede that of a senator. A couple other times he was invited by presidents to hold a high position in government, but just like the first invitation, he also refused those. He always said his calling was not in government. What he did do, however, was he encouraged Christians within the church to vote and become politically active in community affairs and civil movements. Despite not running for office, Graham played a pretty big role in politics as he was involved in the administrations of every president from Truman to Barack Obama, giving them spiritual guidance during their presidencies. He was especially good friends with Richard Nixon. And after the downfall of Nixon, Graham avoided losing too much credibility, thankfully. The reason Graham had become friends with Nixon is because he agreed a lot with his leadership style and his values. And he often prayed with them, including at the 1969 presidential inauguration. He also played a part in the elections of both Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. President Bush attributed his own victory in the election to Graham, saying that he had redeemed him from a drunken wastrel, and he was able to give his life over to Jesus. And this newfound faith allowed him to easily tread the path of politics, which inevitably led to the presidency. Graham did say that if had he not been called to evangelism, he probably would have become a politician, as politics were pretty interesting to him and they're intriguing. Graham, as many others during the 50s, was a staunch anti-communist. During the Korean War, he took a stance against Korean communism and prayed that it would never reach America. At some point during the war, he visited North Korea to give encouragement to the soldiers there and to tell them about how brave they were. So it was kind of nice for them to have him come over there and give them a little bit of a moral boost. He outlined a 5-point program during the war to bring about world peace during a crusade in Washington, D.C. And he also believed that communism was the work of Satan on earth, the antithesis of Christianity, and a war that raged for the very soul of humanity. For Graham, the war on communism was even more important than the war on racial equality. And unfortunately, at the time, he believed that that was a losing battle. Luckily, again, he was incorrect, and he got to see equality in his lifetime. Billy Graham was more than an American evangelist, however. On several occasions, he visited China, which was the birthplace of his wife, Ruth. He spent time in multiple European nations, the Oceania region, and Africa. His ministry through the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association brought the news of Christ to over 200 million people in 185 nations and territories across the globe. Unfortunately, there's so much that he's done, or rather, fortunately, there's so much that he did in his life that it's impossible to cover all of it in this short report on him. But to suffice it to say that his impact on modern Christianity has been such as has never been seen before or since. He was a true man of God, and he dedicated his life to the spread of the gospel message for more than half a century. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his good work, which is the highest honor accorded a private citizen by the President. We can hope that his life and work will never be forgotten, continued on for years to come by those who recognize the importance of saving souls.